The dust cloud rose behind the train as it screeched to a halt at Hillsborough Station, and Natalie Lawson's heart hammered against her ribs as she peered through the smudged window at what would become her new home in the New Mexico territory. But her attention immediately fixed on the pine coffin being unloaded from the cargo car just 2 spaces behind hers. She had traveled for 6 days from Boston, her belongings packed into a single trunk, her future tied to a man she had never met except through carefully penned letters that promised safety, partnership, and perhaps eventually something more. The year was 1882, and desperation had driven many women westward, though Natalie preferred to think of her journey as courage rather than surrender to circumstances beyond her control. She smoothed her traveling dress, navy blue with modest buttons running up to her throat, and gathered her small handbag before stepping onto the platform where the September heat struck her like a physical blow. The coffin sat on a wooden cart nearby, plain and unadorned, and Natalie found herself staring at it with an unexpected surge of sorrow for whoever lay inside. Death had followed her journey west, it seemed, though she had hoped to leave such darkness behind in Massachusetts, where her father had died just 8 months prior, leaving her alone with debts she could never hope to repay on a seamstress's wages. A tall man in worn denim and a dusty hat approached the station master, his boots kicking up small clouds with each step, and Natalie recognized the strong jawline and broad shoulders from the single photograph Kellan Grant had sent her 3 months ago. Her intended husband looked older than his 28 years, weathered by the relentless sun and hard work, but his eyes held a gentleness that the photograph had only hinted at. Kellan spoke with the station master in low tones, gesturing toward the coffin, and Natalie felt intrusive watching this private moment of grief. She stood frozen on the platform, unsure whether to announce herself or wait, when Kellan turned and his gaze landed directly on her. Recognition flickered across his features, followed by something that might have been relief or perhaps resignation. She could not quite tell which. He walked toward her with measured steps, removing his hat to reveal dark hair dampened with sweat, and stopped a respectful distance away. "Miss Lawson, I presume," he said, his voice deeper than she had imagined, rough like gravel underfoot. "Mr. Grant," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the strangeness of meeting the man who expected to marry her within days. "I hope my arrival is not inconvenient given the circumstances." Kellan glanced back at the coffin, his jaw tightening. "The circumstances are what they are. I apologize that your first moments in Hillsborough are marked by death rather than welcome." Natalie shifted her weight, the heat making her feel faint beneath her heavy traveling clothes. "Who did we lose?" The question escaped before she could consider whether she had any right to ask, whether she had earned the word "we" in relation to this town and these people she did not know. Kellan's expression darkened, and he looked away toward the mountains that rose in the distance, purple and imposing against the brilliant blue sky. Thomas Winters. He was the town's deputy, a good man who kept the peace better than most. Got shot breaking up a dispute at the saloon 4 days ago. The other fellow claimed self-defense, but Thomas was not the kind to draw first. The judge ruled it accidental, though most of us know better. The bitterness in his voice surprised Natalie, revealing depths of feeling beneath the stoic exterior. "I am terribly sorry. Were you close friends?" "Close enough," Kellan said, settling his hat back on his head as though the gesture could shield him from further questions. "Thomas helped me when I first came to Hillsborough 5 years ago, taught me which ranchers could be trusted, and which would swindle you blind given half a chance. He was supposed to stand up at our wedding." The mention of their impending marriage hung in the air between them, and Natalie felt the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. She had agreed to marry Kellan through letters that spoke of practical matters, of his cattle ranch that needed a woman's touch and her need for security and a fresh start. Romance had never entered the correspondence, only honest assessments of expectations and character. Yet standing here beside a coffin, planning a wedding while mourning a friend, felt like a bitter beginning to any union. "Perhaps we should postpone," Natalie suggested quietly. "A week or two to allow for proper mourning." Kellan studied her face as though searching for something, and Natalie met his gaze without flinching despite the urge to look away from such intense scrutiny. "You would be willing to wait." Most women who travel this far are eager to secure their position, to make the arrangement legal before circumstances can change. "I am not most women, Mr. Grant," Natalie said with more confidence than she felt. "And I like to think I have enough decency to recognize when celebration would be inappropriate. Besides, I should like to know something of the man I am marrying before we stand before a preacher." A ghost of a smile touched Kellan's lips, gone almost before it appeared. "The hotel has a room available if you need lodging. I can arrange for your trunk to be delivered there." "Thank you," Natalie said, relieved to have at least a temporary reprieve from making any permanent decisions. "I have enough money for a week, perhaps two if I am careful." "No need for that," Kellan said, shaking his head. "I will cover your expenses. You came all this way in good faith, and I will not have you spending your savings because of my town's troubles and my wish to delay." The generosity surprised her, though perhaps it should not have given the tone of his letters, which had always been fair and straightforward. "That is kind of you." "It is decent, not kind," Kellan corrected, picking up her carpetbag before she could protest. "Kindness is something extra. Decency is just doing what ought to be done. Come on, I will show you to the Hillsborough Hotel. It is nothing fancy, but the sheets are clean and Martha, who runs it, makes the best biscuits you will ever taste." Natalie followed him down the platform, very aware of the curious stares from the handful of townspeople who had gathered to meet the train or collect goods. A woman in a faded calico dress whispered to her companion, and Natalie caught the words "mail order" and "pretty enough, I suppose," before they noticed her looking and had the grace to appear embarrassed. She held her head high, refusing to be ashamed of the circumstances that had brought her west. Plenty of marriages began with less acquaintance than she and Kellan had established through their letters, and at least she was choosing this path rather than having it forced upon her by a father's debt or a brother's guardianship. The main street of Hillsborough stretched before them, wider than she had expected, with wooden boardwalks lining both sides and buildings that looked sturdy if not particularly grand. A mercantile, a bank, a land office, 2 saloons, a restaurant, and various other establishments she could not immediately identify filled the storefronts. The hotel stood at the far end, a 2-story structure with a covered porch and rocking chairs positioned to catch whatever breeze might stir the afternoon heat. Martha turned out to be a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing as they swept over Natalie from head to toe. "So you are the one who answered Kellan's advertisement," she said without preamble. "Come from back east, I hear." "Boston," Natalie confirmed, wondering how much this woman knew about her circumstances and how much was simply small-town speculation. "I arrived just now on the afternoon train." "Terrible thing about Thomas," Martha said, her expression softening as she glanced at Kellan. "The whole town will turn out for the funeral tomorrow. Are you still planning on Saturday for the wedding?" "We have decided to postpone," Kellan said before Natalie could respond. "Miss Lawson needs time to settle in, and I have ranch matters that require attention. A few weeks will make no difference in the long run." Martha's eyebrows rose slightly, but she merely nodded and reached for a key hanging on the board behind the desk. "Room 4, top of the stairs and to the left. It has a window facing the street, so you will get the morning light. Supper is served at 6 in the dining room, breakfast at 7. If you need anything else, you just let me know." "Thank you," Natalie said, accepting the key. "I appreciate your hospitality." Kellan carried her bag upstairs and set it just inside the door of room 4, which proved to be a simple space with a narrow bed, a washstand, a wardrobe, and a single chair positioned by the window. The promised view showed the street below and the mountains beyond, and Natalie thought she could be content here for a short while as she adjusted to this strange new world. "I will be at my ranch, about 5 miles north of town," Kellan said, lingering in the doorway. "The bar G, if you need to send word for any reason. I will come into town tomorrow for the funeral and check on how you are settling in." "Mr. Grant," Natalie said impulsively, "would you tell me something about Thomas Winters? If we are delaying our wedding out of respect for his memory, I should like to know what manner of man he was." Kellan leaned against the doorframe, his expression distant. "Thomas was the kind of person who saw the best in folks even when they did not deserve it. He gave me work when I first came to Hillsborough with nothing but a horse and a pocket full of dreams about starting a ranch. Helped me find land that was affordable, introduced me to the bank manager who gave me my first loan. He was only 32, never married, always said he was too busy keeping the peace to court anyone properly. He loved this town, believed it could be more than just another rough settlement that would fade when the silver mines played out. I suppose he was wrong about that last part, at least for himself." The grief in his voice was raw and real, and Natalie felt her heart constrict with sympathy for this man who was technically a stranger but who would soon become her husband. "He sounds like someone worth mourning properly." "I am glad we are waiting." "So am I," Kellan said quietly. "I will see you tomorrow, Miss Lawson. Rest well." He closed the door softly behind him, and Natalie sank onto the bed, suddenly exhausted by the journey and the emotional weight of her arrival. She had expected many things when she stepped off that train, but beginning her new life in the shadow of death had not been among them. Yet perhaps it was fitting in its way, a reminder that the old Natalie Lawson from Boston was gone, left behind with her father's grave, and the cramped boarding house where she had spent her final months in Massachusetts. This new version of herself would be forged in Hillsborough, shaped by the harsh landscape and the people who chose to make their lives in this unforgiving place. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her 2 other dresses in the wardrobe and arranging her hairbrush and soap on the washstand. The trunk also contained a carefully wrapped bundle of letters tied with string, every correspondence Kellan had sent her over the past 3 months. She had read them so many times she nearly had them memorized, learning about his cattle ranch that was slowly growing from a modest operation into something more substantial, his hopes for the future, his honest admission that he wanted a wife for companionship and partnership rather than passionate romance. He had not lied or painted false pictures, and Natalie respected that more than pretty words that promised the moon but delivered nothing. Supper in the hotel dining room introduced her to several other residents of Hillsborough, including Dr. Samuel Morrison, who had a practice above the Mercantile, and Eleanor Gibbons, who ran the town's small school and expressed delight at learning Natalie could read and write well. "We are always in need of educated people in towns like ours," Eleanor said, her enthusiasm making her seem younger than her 40-some years. "If you have any interest in helping with the children's education, I would welcome the assistance." "I was a seamstress in Boston," Natalie admitted, "but I enjoyed reading and learning when I had the opportunity." Perhaps once I am settled, I could contribute in some way." The conversation flowed easily enough, though Natalie remained aware of the speculation behind the friendly questions. Everyone wanted to know about the mail-order bride who had arrived beside a coffin, and whether Kellan Grant's gamble on finding a wife through advertisement would pay off or end in disaster like so many others they had apparently witnessed over the years. Natalie answered what she felt comfortable sharing and deflected the rest with polite vagueness, unwilling to expose her private troubles to strangers who might judge or pity her. That night, she lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of Hillsborough after dark. Voices drifted from the saloons, punctuated by occasional laughter and the tinny notes of an out-of-tune piano. Horses passed by on the street below, their hoofbeats steady and unhurried. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked and the wind picked up, rattling the window in its frame. Natalie thought about Kellan out at his ranch, wondered what his home looked like, and whether she would find a place there or always feel like an outsider who had purchased her way into a life that did not quite fit. The funeral took place at 11 o'clock the next morning in the small church at the edge of town. Natalie debated attending, uncertain whether her presence would be welcome or seen as intrusive. But Martha settled the matter by insisting that everyone who could walk would be there, and it would look strange if she stayed away. So Natalie put on her best black dress, one she had worn to her father's funeral and hoped never to need again so soon, and walked with Martha through the dusty streets to the church. The building was packed with mourners, ranchers and shopkeepers and miners, all crowded together on wooden pews that creaked under the combined weight. Natalie slipped into a back row, not wanting to draw attention, but she spotted Kellan near the front beside several other men who must have been close friends of the deceased. He wore a dark suit that looked uncomfortable on his rangy frame, clearly more accustomed to work clothes than formal attire, and his face was set in grim lines as the minister spoke about dust and ashes and eternal rest. The service was simple and heartfelt, with several people standing to share memories of Thomas Winters and his dedication to Hillsborough. A rancher named Charles Bellamy spoke of how Thomas had tracked down stolen cattle and returned them without asking for thanks or reward. Martha herself stood and told a story about Thomas bringing Christmas dinner to families who could not afford their own, never making a show of his charity, but simply doing what needed to be done. And finally, Kellan rose, his voice steady despite the emotion Natalie could see him fighting to contain. "Thomas believed this town was worth saving," Kellan said, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd. "He believed in justice, not just the letter of the law but the spirit of it. He died trying to prevent violence, stepping between two men who had let whiskey and pride override their common sense. That should not have cost him his life, but it did, and we are all poorer for it. The best way to honor his memory is to prove him right, to make Hillsborough into the kind of place he envisioned, where people look out for each other and settle their disputes without gunfire. I aim to do my part in that, and I hope the rest of you will join me." The words were met with solemn nods and murmured agreement, and Natalie felt a surge of respect for this man she barely knew. It took courage to speak of ideals in a place where survival often trumped morality, where the harsh realities of frontier life could grind down even the strongest principles. That Kellan clung to his despite obvious grief suggested a strength of character that his letters had only hinted at. After the service, the coffin was carried to the small cemetery on a hill overlooking town, and the crowd followed in a slow procession. Natalie walked with Martha and Alina, listening to their quiet conversation about Thomas's life and what his death meant for Hillsborough's future. Apparently there were concerns about who would replace him as deputy, whether the sheriff could manage alone, or if the town would slide into the kind of lawlessness that plagued so many mining settlements. At the graveside, Kellan stood with his hat in his hands as the minister said final words, and the coffin was lowered into the ground. Natalie watched him from a respectful distance, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way his jaw clenched as each shovelful of dirt thudded against the pine wood. She wondered what it cost him to maintain such control, whether he would find release for his grief later in private, or simply bury it along with his friend. When the funeral ended and people began drifting away in small groups, Kellan approached Natalie with slow steps that suggested reluctance or perhaps simple exhaustion. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "It would have seemed strange if my intended bride had not attended, and I appreciate you understanding that." "It seemed the right thing to do," Natalie replied, studying his face, which looked drawn and older than yesterday. "Your words were beautiful, Mr. Grant." Thomas Winters must have been a remarkable man to inspire such loyalty. "He was," Kellan agreed, then seemed to shake himself free of melancholy with visible effort. "I know this is poor timing, but I wondered if you might like to see the ranch tomorrow. It should be part of your decision about whether to go through with the marriage, seeing where you would actually be living. I can come get you around 9 if that suits." The invitation surprised Natalie, though it probably should not have. Kellan was nothing if not practical, and she appreciated that he wanted her to make an informed choice even if it meant risking her rejection once she saw the reality of frontier ranching. 9 o'clock would be fine. Should I bring anything? Just yourself and a hat if you have one, Kellan said. The sun is fierce this time of year, and I would not want you getting sick from heat exposure on your first real day here. I have a bonnet, Natalie offered, touching the simple straw hat she wore now. Will that suffice? Should do well enough, Kellan said, then hesitated as though wanting to say something more but unsure how to phrase it. Finally, he just nodded and turned away, rejoining the group of men who appeared to be heading toward one of the saloons, presumably to toast their fallen friend's memory with whatever whiskey was available. Natalie walked back to the hotel with Martha, who proved to be a wealth of information about Hillsborough's history and residents once she decided to share. The town had been founded 12 years ago when silver was discovered in the nearby mountains, and while the mines had not produced the bonanza everyone hoped for, they provided enough work to sustain a small community. Ranching had become increasingly important as the mining declined, with several operations like Kellan's starting up on the grasslands stretching north toward the mountains. "Kellan is one of the hardest working men I have known," Martha said as they climbed the hotel steps. When he first arrived, he was just a young fellow with big dreams and no capital to speak of. He worked for other ranchers, saved every penny, and finally scraped together enough to buy a small parcel of land and a handful of cattle. That was 5 years ago, and now the Bar G is one of the more successful spreads in the area. He did it all himself, with just hired help during busy seasons. A place like that needs a woman, though, needs someone to make it a home instead of just a camp where men sleep between working. The unspoken message was clear enough. Natalie should not back out of the arrangement simply because the circumstances of her arrival had been less than ideal. She bristled slightly at the presumption, but kept her voice level. "I have no intention of running back to Boston, Martha. I came here in good faith, and I will honor my commitment to at least get to know Mr. Grant and see if we can build a life together. But I will not marry him simply because it would be convenient or expected. We both deserve better than that." Martha's stern expression softened slightly. "Fair enough. I cannot argue with wanting more than just convenience. Lord knows there are enough miserable marriages born from desperation and loneliness without adding yours to the tally. Just give him a real chance, that is all I am saying. Kellan is a good man, and those are rarer than gold in places like this. That evening Natalie sat by her window watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple, and thought about what she was willing to risk for a chance at something better than the life she had left behind. Boston had offered her nothing but poverty and struggle, the constant fear of ending up in a workhouse or worse. Kellan's advertisement had promised security, honesty, and the possibility of building something meaningful with someone who valued partnership over romance. But sitting in this hotel room on the edge of civilization, Natalie found herself hoping for more than just survival. She wanted a home, a real home, and maybe even the kind of love that grew slowly from respect and shared dreams rather than passionate declarations that faded with time. The next morning she dressed in her most practical outfit, a brown skirt and white blouse with sturdy boots she had purchased specifically for frontier life, and waited on the hotel porch with her bonnet shading her face from the already intense sun. Kellan arrived promptly at 9 driving a buckboard wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses, and he helped her up to the seat with hands that were calloused but gentle. "It is about an hour's drive," he said once they were underway, guiding the horses north out of town along a rutted road that was barely more than a suggestion in the dusty earth. "I hope you do not mind the rough travel." "I've come to expect rough travel," Natalie said, gripping the seat as the wagon jolted over a particularly deep rut. The train journey from Boston was hardly luxurious, and at least here the scenery is different from the endless plains I watched for 3 days straight. Kellan glanced at her with what might have been approval. "Most women complain about the conditions out here. I am glad you are not most women." "You mentioned that seemed to be the case," Natalie said, remembering his comment at the train station. "What made you decide to advertise for a wife rather than courting someone local?" The question had been on her mind since she first read his advertisement in the Boston newspaper where a friend had shown it to her. Kellan was clearly a decent man, successful enough to be attractive to potential brides, and from what she had seen, Hillsborough had a shortage of women that should have made him a prime candidate for any unmarried female in the area. Kellan was quiet for a long moment, his attention apparently focused on the horses, though Natalie suspected he was considering how much to reveal. The available women in Hillsborough either have their sights set on minors hoping to strike it rich, or they are widows with children who need a father more than a husband. "I have nothing against children, understand, but I wanted to build something from the start with someone, not step into a ready-made family where I would always be second choice. And the truth is, I am not good at courting. I do not have pretty words or social graces. I am better at honest letters where I can think through what I want to say." The admission was so unvarnished that Natalie felt herself warming to him despite her determination to maintain emotional distance until she knew him better. "I appreciate honesty more than pretty words, Mr. Grant. My father was full of charm and promises, and it left me alone and in debt when he died. I would rather have someone who says what they mean and means what they say." "Then we may suit each other after all," Kellan said, and this time his smile was real, transforming his weathered face into something almost handsome. "And you should probably call me Kellan if we are going to be married eventually. Mr. Grant makes me feel like a stranger." "Kellan," Natalie said, testing the name on her tongue, "and you may call me Natalie." "Natalie," he repeated, and she liked the way he said it, careful and deliberate as though her name mattered. "Tell me about Boston. Your letters mentioned your father died, but not much about your life before that." So Natalie found herself talking as the wagon rolled across the grasslands, telling Kellan about growing up as an only child with a father who worked as a clerk, but dreamed of being a businessman. Her mother had died when Natalie was 12, and after that it had been just her and her father managing as best they could. She had learned sewing to contribute to their household, and discovered she had a talent for intricate work that allowed her to command decent prices from the wealthy women who wanted custom dresses. But her father's gambling debts had consumed everything, and when he died of a heart ailment, Natalie had found herself facing eviction and starvation. "I had no other family, no one who would take me in," she explained, watching the landscape roll by with its strange beauty of scrub brush and distant mountains. "I could have tried to continue as a seamstress, but the best clients wanted someone with a shop and a reputation, and I had neither. I saw your advertisement and thought perhaps starting over completely might be better than trying to salvage a life that had already fallen apart." Kellan nodded slowly. "I understand that impulse. I came west for similar reasons, though my circumstances were different. My family had a farm in Missouri, but when my father died, my older brother inherited everything and made it clear there was no place for me. I could have stayed and worked as a hired hand on land that should have been partly mine, or I could strike out and build something that belonged to me alone. So I came to New Mexico territory and started over." "Do you regret it?" Natalie asked. "Leaving your family even if they treated you poorly?" "Sometimes," Kellan admitted. "Mostly I regret that it had to be that way, that my brother could not see how we might have worked the farm together and made it more successful. But no, I do not regret coming here. This place has been good to me, better than I deserved in many ways. I have land, cattle, a home I built with my own hands. I have friends like Thomas who believed in me when I had no reason to believe in myself. And now I have you, or at least the possibility of you, if we can make this arrangement work." The Bar G Ranch came into view as they crested a low rise, and Natalie caught her breath at the sight. The main house was a simple structure built of adobe and wood with a covered porch running along the front, but it sat in a shallow valley with a creek running beside it and cottonwood trees providing shade. Beyond the house stood a barn, corrals, and several smaller outbuildings, all arranged with a practicality that spoke of careful planning. Cattle grazed in fenced pastures, probably 30 or 40 head from what Natalie could see, and horses occupied a separate enclosure near the barn. "It is not much compared to the big ranches in Texas or Montana," Kellan said, and she heard uncertainty in his voice as though her opinion suddenly mattered more than he wanted to admit. "But it is mine, and it grows a little more each year. I have 200 acres now, with water rights to the creek, and I am slowly building the herd to a size that can support a real operation." "It is beautiful," Natalie said honestly, seeing not just what existed but what could be with time and effort. The house needed a woman's touch, flowers perhaps and curtains in the windows, but the bones were good. "You built all this yourself, with help," Kellan clarified as he pulled the wagon up in front of the house. "I hired men for the heavy construction, but I did most of the finish work myself. Thomas helped with the barn, actually. He was handy with carpentry and enjoyed having a project that did not involve breaking up drunken brawls or tracking horse thieves." The reminder of his friend's death shadowed Kellan's expression, and Natalie touched his arm lightly. "He would be proud of what you have accomplished. Anyone would be." Kellan looked at her hand on his sleeve, and something shifted in his face, a softening of the grief that had marked him since her arrival. "Thank you for that. Come on, let me show you the house." The interior was as practical as the exterior, with a main room that served as kitchen and living space, 2 bedrooms, and a small washroom that Kellan explained had been a recent addition. The furniture was simple but well made, clearly purchased rather than homemade, and everything was clean if not particularly organized. Dishes sat in a neat stack beside a large basin, and the iron stove looked well maintained. The bedroom Kellan showed her had a large bed with a plain quilt, a wardrobe, and a window overlooking the creek. "This would be our room," he said, standing in the doorway as though reluctant to invade the space. "The other bedroom is smaller, meant for children eventually if we are blessed with them. I know that is getting ahead of things, but I wanted to be honest about my hopes for the future." Natalie appreciated that he did not simply assume she would agree to everything without discussion. "Children would be welcome when the time is right. I always imagined having a family, though I had given up on the possibility before your advertisement appeared." They spent the next hour walking the property, with Kellan explaining his operation and his plans for expansion. He wanted to increase his herd to 100 head within 2 years, which would require hiring permanent help rather than just seasonal workers. He hoped to breed horses as well, taking advantage of the good grazing and water access. He spoke with passion about the land and what it could become, and Natalie found herself caught up in his vision despite her determination to remain cautious. "I realize this is a lot to ask of someone who just arrived," Kellan said as they stood on the creek bank watching the water flow over smooth stones. "You barely know me, and you are supposed to trust that I will be a decent husband and that this harsh place can become home. But I promise you this, Natalie. I will work every day to make sure you do not regret coming here. I will respect you, provide for you, and do everything in my power to build a good life for us both. I cannot promise romance or grand gestures, but I can promise honesty and loyalty." Natalie studied his profile, noting the determination in the set of his jaw and the sincerity in his eyes when he finally met her gaze. She thought about the alternatives she had left behind, the bleak prospects and constant fear. She thought about this man who had built something from nothing and wanted to share it with someone. And she thought about the way her heart had begun to beat a little faster when he spoke of the future as though she were already a part of it. "I need time," she said carefully. "Not months, but perhaps another week or two to adjust and to know you better before we make this permanent. Can you accept that?" "I can," Kellan said without hesitation. "Take whatever time you need. I would rather wait and have you be certain than rush and have you be miserable." They rode back to Hillsborough in companionable silence, and when Kellan helped her down from the wagon in front of the hotel, his hands lingered on her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. "I will come to town in a few days," he said. "Perhaps we could have dinner together, something more than just business discussions about the ranch." "I would like that," Natalie said, surprised to discover she meant it. "Thank you for showing me your home, Kellan. It helped me see what we might build together." That evening, Natalie wrote a letter to her friend Margaret in Boston, describing her arrival in Hillsborough and her first impressions of Kellan Grant. She found herself emphasizing his honesty and work ethic, the way he had delayed their wedding out of respect for his friend, and the beautiful ranch he had built. Reading back over her words, Natalie realized she sounded almost hopeful, and the thought both pleased and frightened her. She had been hurt too many times by hope, disappointed by promises that turned to ash. But perhaps this time could be different. Perhaps Kellan was different. The next few days passed in a strange suspended state where Natalie existed between her old life and her potential new one. She helped Alina at the school for 2 afternoons, reading with the younger children and mending torn books. She took tea with Martha and learned the intricate web of relationships and grudges that defined small-town life. She walked the streets of Hillsborough, familiarizing herself with the mercantile and the land office and the small church where Thomas's funeral had been held. And she thought about Kellan, remembering the way he had looked at his ranch with such pride and purpose, the gentle way he had helped her down from the wagon, the raw grief in his voice when he spoke of his lost friend. She wondered if she could love him eventually, whether the practical partnership they had agreed to might transform into something deeper and more meaningful. The question kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her hotel room and listening to the sounds of a town that was slowly becoming familiar. Kellan came to town 4 days after showing her the ranch, and they had dinner at the small restaurant that served simple but hearty fare. He had cleaned up for the occasion, his hair neatly combed and his shirt freshly laundered, and Natalie found herself noticing details she had missed before. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the scar on his left hand from some long-ago injury, the careful way he chose his words as though each one mattered. They talked about inconsequential things at first, the weather and the cattle prices and Alina's enthusiasm for expanding the school's library. But as the meal progressed and the restaurant emptied, their conversation turned more personal. Kellan told her about his childhood in Missouri, the complicated relationship with his brother, the loneliness of starting over in a place where he knew no one. Natalie shared her own memories of growing up with a father who loved her but could not provide stability, the gradual realization that she would have to save herself because no one else would do it for her. "You think people can change?" Kellan asked suddenly, turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the table. "Or are we just stuck with who we are, making the best of our nature?" Natalie considered the question carefully. "I think people can grow and learn, but fundamental nature probably stays the same. Someone selfish will always have to fight that impulse even if they learn to overcome it. Someone honest does not have to work as hard because honesty comes naturally. But yes, I believe change is possible if someone wants it badly enough. Why do you ask?" "I have been thinking about Thomas and what he said to me a year ago," Kellan explained, his expression troubled. "He told me I was too closed off, that I kept people at a distance because I was afraid of being hurt again like my brother hurt me. He said if I wanted a real marriage and not just an arrangement, I would have to learn to let someone in, to be vulnerable even though it felt dangerous. I laughed it off at the time, but now that he is gone and you are here, I keep hearing his voice telling me not to waste this chance." The admission hung between them, and Natalie felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "I think Thomas was wise, and I think you are already letting me in by telling me this. That takes courage, Kellan, or foolishness," he said with a slight smile. "I am not good at this, Natalie. I have spent 5 years building walls around myself, focusing on work because it was safer than risking my heart again. But I do not want to live like that anymore. I want what Thomas talked about, a real partnership with someone I can trust completely. I think you could be that person if we both try." Natalie reached across the table and placed her hand over his, feeling the rough calluses and the strength in his fingers. "I want that too. I am scared of being hurt again, of making another mistake that I cannot recover from. But I am more scared of spending my life alone and wondering what might have been if I had been braver. So yes, let us both try. Let us see if we can build something real together." Kellan turned his hand over and clasped hers gently, and for the first time since stepping off the train beside that coffin, Natalie felt genuinely hopeful about her future. They sat in the quiet restaurant holding hands across the table, and it felt like a promise, unspoken but understood. The days that followed established a pattern that felt almost like courtship, despite the strangeness of their situation. Kellan came to town every few days, always finding excuses about needing supplies or having business at the bank, but really just wanting to see Natalie. They walked together through Hillsborough, visited the school, sat on the hotel porch talking until the stars came out. He told her about his cattle and his plans for the ranch, and she told him about the books she loved and her dreams of creating a real home. 2 weeks after her arrival, Kellan asked if she would come back to the ranch and stay for a few days, properly chaperoned by his housekeeper, who came twice a week to help with cooking and cleaning. "I want you to see what daily life is actually like," he explained. "Not just the pretty tour I gave you before, but the reality of hard work and isolation and everything that comes with ranch life. If you can handle that and still want to stay, then I will know we can make this work." Natalie agreed, both excited and nervous about this next step. She packed a bag with enough clothes for 3 days and rode out to the Bar G with Kellan on a bright morning when the sky stretched endless and blue overhead. The housekeeper turned out to be a Mexican woman named Rosa, who spoke limited English but communicated volumes with her expressive face and warm smile. She showed Natalie around the house again, this time pointing out where things were kept and how the stove worked and which pump provided the best water. That first full day at the ranch, Natalie threw herself into making herself useful. She helped Rosa with laundry, scrubbing clothes in the large basin and hanging them to dry in the hot sun. She prepared vegetables for the evening meal, her knife skills from her seamstress days translating well to kitchen work. She explored the creek, discovering a quiet spot where the water pooled deep enough for wading, and she sat there for a while watching dragonflies skim the surface and listening to the endless whisper of the cottonwood leaves. Kellan worked from dawn until dusk, riding out to check on the cattle, repairing fences, and handling the 1,000 small tasks that kept a ranch running. But he made time to eat meals with Natalie and Rosa, and in the evenings after the day's work was done, he and Natalie would sit on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains and talking about everything and nothing. "I could be happy here," Natalie said on the second evening as they sat side by side on the porch steps. "I thought I would miss Boston, the noise and the people and the sense of things happening, but I do not. This feels right in a way nothing ever has before." Kellan looked at her with such undisguised longing that Natalie's breath caught. "Does that mean you have decided about marrying me?" "Yes," Natalie said, and saying the word out loud made it real in a way it had not been before. "Yes, I will marry you, Kellan Grant. I think we can build something good together, something worth fighting for." Kellan stood and pulled her to her feet, his hands gentle on her arms. "I will do everything in my power to make you happy, Natalie. I swear that on everything I hold dear." And then he kissed her, soft and careful as though she were something precious that might break if handled roughly. Natalie melted into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest where she could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. The kiss deepened, and she tasted coffee and something indefinably male, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "That was my first kiss," Kellan admitted, his ears reddening with embarrassment. "I hope it was not too terrible." Natalie laughed, delighted by his honesty even in this. "It was perfect, and for what it is worth, I have only been kissed once before by a boy when I was 16, and that was nothing like this. This felt real." They stood on the porch with their arms around each other, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, and Natalie knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. This might not be the grand romance of novels and fairy tales, but it was something better. A partnership built on honesty and respect and the willingness to work together toward a shared future. The wedding was held 10 days later in the small church, with most of Hillsborough in attendance. Natalie wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric purchased at the mercantile, pale blue with lace at the collar and cuffs, and Martha had lent her a string of pearls that had belonged to her mother. Kellan wore his dark suit again, looking uncomfortable but handsome, and when he took her hand at the altar, his grip was steady and sure. Eleanor stood up as Natalie's witness, and Charles Bellamy stood for Kellan, filling the role Thomas would have occupied. The minister spoke about partnership and commitment, about building a life together through good times and bad, and when he asked if they would take each other as husband and wife, Natalie's "I do" rang clear and certain through the small church. The reception was held at the hotel, with Martha providing a feast that must have taken days to prepare. There was roasted beef and fresh bread, vegetables from local gardens, and a cake that Eleanor had baked and decorated with wildflowers. People congratulated them with genuine warmth, and Natalie felt herself truly welcomed into the community for the first time. She was no longer just the mail-order bride who had arrived beside a coffin, but Natalie Grant, wife of Kellan and member of Hillsborough. That night, they rode out to the Bar G together as husband and wife, and Kellan carried Natalie over the threshold of the house that was now truly their home. He set her down gently in the main room, and they stood looking at each other with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. "I want you to be happy here," Kellan said softly. "Tell me what you need, and I will do my best to provide it." "I just need you," Natalie replied, taking his hands in hers. "Everything else we can figure out together." Their wedding night was tender and awkward and sweet, two people learning each other's bodies and hearts in the darkness. Kellan was gentle despite his inexperience, and Natalie found herself grateful for his patience and care. When they finally lay tangled together in the aftermath, both breathing hard and smiling, she felt something settle deep in her chest, a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. The weeks that followed established the rhythm of their married life. Natalie threw herself into making the house a home, sewing curtains for the windows and planting a garden near the creek where she grew vegetables and herbs. She learned to cook on the temperamental stove, producing meals that improved steadily from barely edible to quite good. She helped Kellan with ranch work when he needed an extra pair of hands, learning to tend cattle and mend fences despite her complete lack of experience. And gradually, carefully, they fell in love. It was not a sudden thing, not a lightning strike of passion, but rather a slow accumulation of moments that built into something unshakable. Natalie fell in love with the way Kellan always kissed her goodbye before riding out in the morning, with his patience when she made mistakes, with the pride in his eyes when she mastered some new skill. Kellan fell in love with Natalie's laughter echoing through the house, with her determination to succeed at everything she attempted, with the way she listened to his dreams and added her own ideas to make them better. 3 months into their marriage, as they lay in bed one night with Natalie's head resting on Kellan's chest, she said the words that had been building in her heart for weeks. "I love you, Kellan Grant. Not because I should or because we are married, but because you are the best man I have ever known and I cannot imagine my life without you." Kellan's arms tightened around her, and his voice was rough with emotion when he replied, "I love you too, Natalie. I think I started falling the day you asked who we had lost, when you showed compassion for someone you did not even know. You made this house a home, but more than that, you made my life something worth living beyond just work and survival." They made love that night with a depth of feeling that transformed the physical act into something transcendent, a joining not just of bodies but of souls. And afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, they talked about the future they would build together, about children and expanding the ranch and growing old side by side. The winter that followed was harsh, with snow blanketing the valley and temperatures dropping so low that the creek froze solid. But the house was warm and well stocked with supplies, and Natalie discovered she did not mind the isolation. She and Kellan spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud from books she had ordered from back east, playing cards, and simply talking about anything and everything. The work was hard, keeping the cattle fed and the animals sheltered, but they did it together, and that made all the difference. By spring, Natalie suspected she was pregnant, and Dr. Morrison confirmed it when she and Kellan made a trip into Hillsborough for supplies. The news sent Kellan into a panic of preparation, fixing up the small bedroom and insisting Natalie stop doing heavy work around the ranch. She tolerated his fussing with good humor, knowing it came from love even when it was excessive. "I am growing a baby, not dying of consumption," she finally said one evening when he tried to stop her from carrying a basket of laundry. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time, Kellan. I promise I will be careful, but you cannot wrap me in cotton wool for 9 months." "I just want you safe," Kellan said, looking so genuinely worried that Natalie's heart melted. "I cannot lose you, Natalie. You are everything to me." She set down the laundry and pulled him into an embrace, feeling his tension slowly ease as he held her. "You are not going to lose me. I am strong, and Dr. Morrison says everything looks perfectly normal. We are going to have a baby, Kellan, and that is something to celebrate, not fear." Their daughter was born in November during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and turned the creek into a rushing torrent. Dr. Morrison attended the birth along with Rosa and Martha, and after hours of labor that tested Natalie's strength to its limits, she finally held her daughter in her arms. The baby had Kellan's dark hair and Natalie's nose, and she screamed with impressive volume when the doctor cleared her airway. "She is perfect," Kellan whispered, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his wife and daughter. "You are both perfect." They named her Catherine Rose, after Natalie's mother and the wild roses that grew along the creek. Little Kate proved to have a strong will and healthy lungs, keeping her parents awake through many long nights, but neither of them minded. Natalie had never imagined she could feel such overwhelming love, such fierce protectiveness toward another human being. And watching Kellan with their daughter, seeing him cradle her tiny form with such gentleness and awe, only deepened Natalie's love for her husband. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. The ranch continued to grow, with Kellan eventually reaching his goal of 100 head of cattle and beginning a successful horse breeding program. They hired permanent help, 2 young men who built their own small cabin on the property and became almost like family. Natalie established a small sewing business, making dresses and shirts for people in Hillsborough and the surrounding ranches, work she could do at home while caring for Kate. 2 years after Kate's birth, Natalie gave birth to a son they named Henry Thomas, honoring Kellan's lost friend. The boy had Kellan's green eyes and a calm temperament that was already evident in infancy. Kate adored her little brother with the intensity only a toddler can muster, constantly wanting to help feed him and hold him and show him her treasures. The children grew up wild and free on the ranch, learning to ride almost before they could walk, helping with chores as soon as they were able, and playing endless games along the creek that ran through their property. Natalie watched them with joy tinged with bittersweet awareness of how quickly time passed, how these precious years of childhood would be gone before she knew it. Hillsborough continued its slow evolution from rough mining town to established community. A railroad spur was built connecting to the main line, bringing more reliable access to markets and supplies. The school expanded, and Alina recruited Natalie to teach sewing classes to the older girls. The church got a new minister, and a library was established above the mercantile with books donated from back east. Through it all, Natalie and Kellan's love deepened and matured, weathering disagreements and hardships with the strength of their commitment to each other. There were difficult times. A drought one year that decimated the cattle herd, an outbreak of influenza that struck Kate when she was 5 and left them all terrified for weeks, the death of Rosa, who had become like a grandmother to their children. But they faced each challenge together, and their marriage emerged stronger for it. On their 10th anniversary, Kellan surprised Natalie with a trip back to Boston. He had been saving for years, wanting to show her that he could provide not just necessities but luxuries as well. They left the children with Martha and took the train east, retracing the journey Natalie had made a decade earlier with such uncertainty and hope. Boston had changed, grown larger and more industrial, but Natalie found she felt no nostalgia for her old life. She showed Kellan the boarding house where she had lived, now torn down and replaced with a warehouse, and the church where her father was buried. They visited museums and restaurants, attended a theater performance, and stayed in a hotel that Natalie once would have considered impossibly grand. But through it all, she found herself longing for home, for the wide open spaces of New Mexico and the life they had built there. And she could see Kellan felt the same, uncomfortable in the crowded city, eager to return to the ranch and the children and the work that gave his life meaning. "I am glad we came," Natalie said on the train heading west, watching the landscape gradually transform from urban sprawl to farmland to prairie. "But I am even more glad to be going home. Strange how the place I was so nervous about has become the only place I want to be." Kellan took her hand, lacing their fingers together in the familiar gesture that had become second nature over the years. "You made it home, Natalie. Before you arrived, the ranch was just a place I worked. You turned it into something more, a real home where I belong, where we both belong." They arrived back in Hillsboro on a golden autumn afternoon, and Kate and Henry came running to greet them with such enthusiasm that Natalie nearly fell over from their enthusiastic hugs. That evening, with the children finally asleep and the house quiet, Natalie and Kellan sat on their porch watching the stars emerge overhead, and she felt such profound gratitude for the path that had led her here. "You ever think about that day at the train station?" Kellan asked, apparently following a similar train of thought. "When you arrived beside Thomas's coffin?" "Sometimes," Natalie admitted. "It seemed like such a terrible omen at the time, beginning a new life in the shadow of death. But in a strange way, it brought us together more deeply than we might have otherwise. Your grief and your honesty about it showed me who you really were, Kellan. It made me trust you when I had no other reason to." "Thomas would have liked you," Kellan said softly. "He would have been glad to know that his death somehow brought us closer together, that something good came from that tragedy. I still miss him, probably always will, but the pain is not as sharp as it once was. Time and love have a way of healing even the deepest wounds." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the familiar landscape fade into darkness, and Natalie reflected on how much her life had changed since that September day when she stepped off the train with her heart full of fear and desperate hope. She had come to Hillsboro expecting only survival, a practical arrangement that would provide security in exchange for domestic labor. Instead, she had found love, real love, the kind that deepened with time and weathered every storm. She had found home, not just a physical place but a sense of belonging that went soul deep. And she had found herself, the person she was always meant to be when freed from the constraints of poverty and the weight of her father's failures. More years passed, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growing pains and triumphs of raising children. Kate grew into a spirited young woman who could rope cattle as well as any man, and had her father's determination combined with her mother's grace. Henry proved to be a natural horseman, gentle and patient with the animals, and showed promise of becoming an even better rancher than Kellan. They were both still young, Kate only 16 and Henry 14, but already Natalie could see the adults they were becoming. The ranch itself had transformed from Kellan's modest operation into one of the most successful in the territory. They now ran 200 head of cattle and had established a reputation for breeding quality horses that sold throughout New Mexico and into Texas. The original house had been expanded with 2 additional rooms and a proper dining area, and the barn had been rebuilt twice to accommodate their growing operation. But more important than the material success was the life they had created, the family they had built from nothing more than desperate hope and determination to make the best of an uncertain situation. Natalie looked at Kellan across the dinner table each evening, silver now threading through his dark hair and lines of age marking his face, and loved him more than she had thought possible all those years ago when she agreed to marry a stranger. One evening in early spring, as they prepared for bed, Kellan pulled a letter from his pocket. This came today from the land office. They are finally granting statehood petitions, and New Mexico should become a state within the next few years. Can you imagine? We will have been here through territorial days and into statehood. Our children will grow up as citizens of a state, not just a territory. Natalie took the letter, reading through the formal language about surveys and political processes. It is strange to think how much has changed since I arrived. Hillsboro was barely more than a collection of buildings around a train station. Now we have a proper school, a library, 3 churches, and a town council that actually governs instead of just arguing in saloons. Progress, Kellan agreed, though his tone suggested mixed feelings about it. Sometimes I miss the simplicity of the early days, even if life was harder, but I suppose change is inevitable. The children will inherit a different world than the one we found, hopefully a better one. We will make sure of it, Natalie said firmly. That is what Thomas believed, remember, that Hillsboro could become something more than just another rough settlement. We have already proven him right, and we will keep working to make this place worthy of his faith. They climbed into bed, and Kellan pulled Natalie close, her back against his chest in the position they had slept in for years. I love you, he murmured against her hair. Every day I thank God or fate or whatever brought you to that train platform beside a coffin. Best thing that ever happened to me, even if the circumstances were terrible. I love you too, Natalie replied, lacing her fingers through his where they rested over her heart. And I am grateful every single day that I was brave enough to step off that train and give us a chance. This life, this love, it is more than I ever dreamed possible. They drifted off to sleep holding each other. 2 people who had started as strangers bound by desperation and practicality, but who had built something extraordinary through patience, honesty, and willingness to be vulnerable with each other. Their love story would never be written in books or celebrated in songs, but it was real and enduring, a testament to the power of choosing to love even when circumstances seemed bleak. The seasons continued their endless cycle, spring giving way to summer, summer to fall, fall to winter, and winter back to spring again. Kate began courting a young man from a neighboring ranch, and Kellan struggled with letting his daughter grow up even as he recognized she had become a remarkable young woman. Henry took on more responsibility at the bar, proving himself capable and mature beyond his years. Natalie continued her sewing, though now she also spent time helping Alina at the school and serving on various town committees. She had become a respected member of the community, sought out for advice on everything from child rearing to managing household accounts. The frightened young woman who had arrived from Boston was gone, replaced by someone confident and grounded, secure in her place in the world. One afternoon in late summer, Natalie was working in her garden when she heard a wagon approaching. Looking up, she saw an unfamiliar couple, the woman clearly pregnant and looking exhausted from travel. They pulled up to the house, and the man called out asking for directions to Hillsborough proper. Natalie provided the directions, but something about the woman's expression, a mixture of hope and fear, struck a chord of recognition. "Are you new to the area?" she asked gently. "We are coming from Kansas," the woman replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband has work lined up at one of the ranches outside Hillsborough. We are hoping to make a fresh start." The words echoed so closely to Natalie's own journey that she found herself inviting them in for refreshment and rest before they continued into town. As she poured water and brought out fresh bread and preserves, the woman began to relax, and eventually the story came out in bits and pieces. They had lost their farm to debt, spent the last of their money on wagon and supplies to make the journey west, and were terrified that the promised work would fall through leaving them stranded. Natalie listened with compassion, remembering her own fear and uncertainty, and when they prepared to leave, she sent them off with extra food and a note of introduction to Martha at the hotel. "Hillsborough is a good place," she told them. "Hard but fair. If you are willing to work and be part of the community, you will find a home here." After they left, Natalie stood on the porch watching their wagon disappear down the road toward town, and thought about the strange paths that brought people to new places and new lives. She had arrived beside a coffin, marked by death before she even began, but had found life and love beyond anything she imagined possible. That young couple would write their own story, face their own challenges, and hopefully find their own happiness in this harsh but beautiful land. Kellan rode up from the south pasture and found her still standing there, lost in thought. "Who was that?" he asked, dismounting and coming to stand beside her. "People looking for a fresh start," Natalie said, slipping her arm around his waist. "They reminded me of us all those years ago." Kellan kissed the top of her head, a gesture of such casual affection that it still made Natalie's heart flutter even after all this time. "We did all right for ourselves, I think. Better than all right." "We did indeed," Natalie agreed, looking out over the ranch they had built together, the life they had created from nothing more than hope and determination. "We absolutely did." 23 years after Natalie first stepped off that train in Hillsborough, she and Kellan sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Kate had married her rancher and given them 2 beautiful granddaughters, and Henry was courting a schoolteacher from Santa Fe, who made him smile in ways that reminded Natalie of how Kellan looked at her. The Bar G was now managed by all of them together, a true family operation that would continue into future generations. The world had changed dramatically since 1882. New Mexico had achieved statehood in 1912, and Hillsborough had grown into a prosperous town with electricity and telephone lines and automobiles, replacing horses for some purposes. But the essential character of the place remained, that combination of hardship and beauty that defined frontier life even as the frontier itself slowly disappeared. "You ever regret it?" Kellan asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Leaving Boston, marrying a stranger, building a life out here so far from everything you knew." Natalie turned to look at her husband, this man who had been her partner through decades of joy and struggle, who had given her a life rich with meaning and love. His hair was now completely gray, his face deeply lined, his hands gnarled with arthritis from years of hard work. But his eyes still held the same gentleness she had noticed on that first day, and his love for her had never wavered through all the years. "Never," she said firmly, taking his weathered hand in hers. "Not for a single moment. This life, this love, everything we built together, it was worth every risk, every hardship, every moment of uncertainty. You gave me a home, Kellan Grant, not just a house but a real home where I belong. And I gave you the same. We saved each other in all the ways that matter. Kellan brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. I asked who we lost that day at the train station, and you told me about Thomas. But the real answer is that we had both lost our way before we found each other. You had lost your family and your security, and I had lost my faith that I could have more than just work and survival. Together, we found what we needed. Together, Natalie echoed, resting her head on his shoulder as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the mountains. Always together. The grandchildren's laughter rang out across the yard, and Kate called out that supper would be ready soon, and the familiar sounds of family life surrounded them like a warm embrace. Natalie closed her eyes and let herself simply feel the moment, the weight of Kellan's arm around her shoulders, the cooling breeze as evening approached, the profound sense of peace that came from a life well lived. She had arrived in Hillsborough beside a coffin, marked by death and uncertainty, but she had found life beyond measure. She had come as a mail-order bride with nothing to offer but desperation and determination, and she had become a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a pillar of her community. She had married a stranger out of necessity, and he had become the love of her life, her partner in every sense of the word. Some love stories began with passion and drama, with grand gestures and sweeping romance. But Natalie's love story had begun with grief and practical necessity, with two damaged people choosing to be vulnerable with each other, and building something beautiful from the fragments of their broken pasts. It was not the stuff of fairy tales or dime novels, but it was real and lasting and more precious than gold. As the sun set over the ranch they had built together, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Natalie Grant held her husband's hand and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The mail-order bride who had stepped off the train beside a coffin had found not just a home, but everything her heart had ever desired. And that, she thought with profound gratitude, was the very best kind of happy ending.